Throughout much of our lives, we are conditioned to believe that youth is the pinnacle of existence, a time of vitality, achievement, and endless possibility. Everything before 30 feels urgent. Everything after 40 begins to sound like an inevitable decline. But Carl Jung, the renowned Swiss psychologist, offered a completely different and deeply liberating perspective. He believed that real life, the one infused with soul, meaning, and authenticity, doesn't begin until after 40. Until then, we're merely doing the psyche's homework. Life really begins at 40, Jung once said. Up until then, you're just doing research. It's a bold perspective, and for many a disorienting one. But it reveals a fundamental truth about our psychological development. The first 40 years are not the climax of the journey, but the rehearsal. It's a period of gathering data, experimenting, adapting, not the final version of who we are. We are taught to collect degrees, start families, climb the corporate ladder. We do all this believing that external success will bring us internal peace. But according to Jung, this process is merely the foundation. Until 40, what we're really doing is constructing a character, a social role that fits into the world's expectations. But that character is not the totality of our soul. It's the functional avatar that allows us to survive and succeed within a system. True life, the kind that pulses from the inside out, only begins when we have the courage to look inward and ask, who am I really? That question rarely arises early. It comes when the shine of accomplishment starts to fade, when we realize that no external validation can fill the silent void we carry within. And it is at this turning point, the one many call a crisis, that Jung saw the opportunity for rebirth. Because ultimately, to live is not merely to exist, it's to become conscious of who we are behind the mask. And that awareness, that authentic awakening of the soul, rarely arrives before the age of 40. In the first 40 years of life, we are, almost without realizing it, constructing a kind of psychic armor. Carl Jung called this structure the persona, the social face we present to the world. It's not about being fake or deceptive. It's a legitimate adaptation necessary for surviving in society. From childhood, we learn to mold ourselves to the expectations of others. We seek the approval of parents, teachers, and peers. We grow up absorbing the norms of the culture around us, learning what is acceptable, what is admirable, what is considered success. We build our identity from the outside in, and for a while it works. We build careers, gain recognition, and become someone. But this persona, while useful, is only part of the story. Jung warned that the real danger arises when we mistake this mask for our true self, when we forget that it is a role, not our essence. The first 40 years, then, are a phase of experimentation. We try to figure out who we are through what we do. It is as if we are trying on different costumes to see which one fits best. The successful professional, the ideal partner, the exemplary child. But inevitably, there comes a moment when that persona starts to feel tight. We begin to sense something unreal or incomplete about the performance, that no matter how well we play the part, there's still an emptiness that refuses to go away. That discomfort is the soul's calling. Jung would say it's the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. But before that can happen, we must face the truth. The persona was an essential phase, but now it needs to be transcended. And this shift only begins when we are mature enough to see that life cannot be lived solely to please others, that the true path is not about appearing but about being, and that truth almost always only reveals itself after the first 40 years. The awakening of the soul rarely happens with fanfare. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or dramatic revelations. On the contrary, it usually begins in silence, as a quiet discomfort, a whispered doubt at the edge of an ordinary afternoon. It is that solitary moment when you stare out the window after a seemingly successful day and ask yourself, is this all there is? Carl Jung identified this moment as the beginning of individuation, a process that starts with questions that refuse to go away. They don't shout, they persist. Am I living the life I want, or the life others expected of me? Who am I when no one is watching? These questions are seeds. At first glance, they seem uncomfortable, even inconvenient. They arise in the middle of established routines, on milestone birthdays, after promotions that bring no joy. They show up when old dreams no longer excite and old fears no longer paralyze. They simply exhaust. These doubts are not flaws in the process. They are the process. They are the invitation to a deeper journey where the goal is no longer public perfection, but inner truth. It's common to mistake this moment for a crisis, but Jung invites us to look from another angle. What if it's not a collapse, but a revelation? What if these questions are the soul trying to speak after decades of silence? The silent awakening is a sacred stage because it marks the end of autopilot. It is the moment life stops being a repetition of expectations and begins to transform into a conscious creation. It is not about destroying everything that has been built, but about recognizing that something within us wants to grow beyond the persona, and that something will no longer tolerate being ignored. When those questions begin to surface, the inner clock awakens. The real journey begins, and from that point on there is no return to the comfort of illusion. The process of individuation, according to Carl Jung, is the deepest journey a human being can undertake, the journey back to oneself. It's not about becoming something new, but about becoming who you have always been, beneath the masks, the roles, the expectations. It is the unveiling of the authentic self. After decades of shaping the persona to function in the outer world, the soul begins to call for a return, and that return is not peaceful. It requires courage to look inward with radical honesty. Jung said that the process of individuation truly begins when we recognize that life can no longer be guided solely by external goals. Something within us begins to cry out for meaning, for internal coherence, for integration. And this is the key point. Individuation is not about perfection, it is about integration. It's about embracing the rejected parts, the denied impulses, the feelings buried in the unconscious, what Jung called the shadow. It includes unprocessed pain, suffocated desires, misunderstood emotions. What do we do with all of that? In the process of individuation, we do not repress, we welcome, because we can only be whole when we stop denying parts of ourselves. This process is intimate, solitary, and often uncomfortable. It is like descending into the depths of the psyche to find the gold buried beneath the chaos. It is also gradual. You don't arrive at individuation overnight. Each insight, each crisis, each silence heavy with meaning is a step on this path. What's curious is that the more whole we become, the lighter we feel. Life begins to make sense, not because it becomes easier, but because it is now lived from inner truth, not outward performance. This process can shake certainties, redefine relationships, and change directions. But that is precisely what makes it sacred, because only when we become whole can we finally live with freedom, authenticity, and peace. The shadow, for Carl Jung, is not evil in itself, but everything we have rejected within ourselves. It is made up of the aspects of our personality that were banished to the unconscious because at some point we were told they were wrong, ugly, or unacceptable. The child who learned they weren't allowed to feel anger becomes an adult who explodes without understanding why. The girl who was punished for expressing ambition becomes a woman who feels guilty every time she wants something big. The shadow is built from these fragments, fears, impulses, desires, traumas, that we learn to hide in order to be loved or accepted. But what is rejected does not disappear. It accumulates at the edges of consciousness and, over time, begins to surface in disguised forms, projections, self-sabotage, recurring crises. It's like a cry from the unconscious, begging to be seen. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Facing the shadow is not diving into chaos. It is bringing light to what was left in the dark. It is looking inward and saying, "Yes, I am this too. I also feel envy. I also carry pride. I also fear not being enough." And that's okay, because only acceptance leads to integration. Only compassion softens the rigidity of the ego. When we face the shadow with honesty and without judgment, it ceases to be an enemy and becomes a source of wisdom. Often, right where our pain lives, lies our unrecognized potential. Repressed anger, hides the vital impulse to protect oneself. Fear masks the sensitivity that longs for safety. The shadow, once integrated, returns lost pieces of the soul to us. Is facing it hard? Yes. But avoiding it is far worse, because what we refuse to face ends up controlling our lives from behind the scenes. In the process of individuation, the shadow is no longer a monster to be avoided, but a bridge to wholeness. Only by embracing our darkness can we truly know the depth of our light. During the first half of life, we are taught, often without even realizing it, to follow an invisible script that defines what a successful life should look like. This script pushes us toward degrees, careers, status, financial goals, stable relationships, and a carefully curated social image. We want to prove that we're capable, that we are someone in the world. We chase recognition, approval, belonging, but at some point, usually around midlife, that same script begins to fall apart. Not because it was wrong, but because it was temporary. It served to build a social identity, but not an essential one. And that is when the search for success quietly begins to give way to the search for meaning. The things that once drove us, promotions, goals, applause, no longer satisfy in the same way. There's a weariness that sets in from chasing achievements that now feel hollow. A restlessness arises, even when everything seems to be going right. It is in this moment that deeper questions begin to emerge. Why am I doing all of this? Whose life am I really living? What actually matters, now that I've accomplished so much? This transition is not just psychological, it's spiritual. It's as if the soul finally says, now it's my turn. The search for meaning is quieter, less visible, but infinitely more powerful. It leads us toward more authentic choices, truer relationships and actions that are aligned with who we really are. The need to appear gives way to the desire to feel. The ego makes room for the soul. And life, once measured by performance, begins to be measured by presence. This is the point at which many people change careers, leave toxic relationships, rediscover art, nature, or the silence they once ignored. It's not an escape, it's a return. A return to what always mattered, but was buried beneath the noise of the early years. The search for meaning is not a luxury, it is a mature soul's urgency, and once it begins, there is no turning back. Because what we experience in this awakening is something no external success could ever offer, the peace that comes from living in alignment with our inner truth. The word crisis often carries a negative weight, collapse, failure, ending. But from Jung's perspective, and through the lens of deeper psychology, the midlife crisis is not a defeat, it's a necessary deconstruction. It's as if the structure you built with so much effort in the first 40 years begins to crack. Not because of incompetence, but because that structure was designed to support a phase of life, not the entire journey. This crisis, which many label as a breakdown, is in fact the breakdown of an identity that can no longer hold the soul. It is uncomfortable, yes, sometimes painful. It may involve symbolic losses, the end of a marriage, leaving a job, a radical shift in values. But this is not failure. It is the fertile ground where transformation begins. Deconstruction reveals what was hidden, real desires, rejected parts, neglected truths. It is as if life were saying, you made it this far being who others needed you to be. Now it's time to become who you truly are. And that rupture from the old can be seen not as a tragedy, but as a liberation. It's the chance to rewrite your story, to rebuild from the inside out. Jung called this process unraveling, the unwinding of the persona, the peeling away of the masks. And though it's unsettling to let go of what once felt solid, there's a quiet power in it. Because only when the false crumbles can the true begin to emerge. The crisis is not the end of the road. It is the necessary detour that leads you to the path that has always been calling, the one that urgency and fear kept you from hearing. When you see the crisis as a calling, and not as punishment, it becomes the most important crossing of your life, the journey back to yourself. There comes a moment when the soul begins to whisper louder than the world shouts. It is at this point, often right in the middle of life, that the call to authenticity arises. It doesn't arrive as a grand announcement, but as a quiet unease. Something no longer fits. The roles that once brought pride now feel constricting. The achievements that once served as trophies now feel empty. And this is where the silent transition begins, from a self built for the world to a self built from within. Abraham Maslow called this movement self-actualization, the fundamental impulse to realize our true potential, not just in what we do, but in who we are. It's an awakening that asks, this life I'm living, is it really mine? Authenticity isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about aligning what you feel, think, and do. It means living without betraying yourself, and that takes courage, because the cost of authenticity can be high. It might mean disappointing others, leaving comfort zones, or changing your path entirely. But the reward is unmatched: inner peace, clarity, real connection. When you begin to live in truth, even silence changes its tone. It stops being empty and becomes full. Self-actualization, then, isn't a prize at the end of life. It's a way of living in presence, in integrity. It's looking in the mirror and recognizing your soul, not just your face. The call to authenticity doesn't ask you to change the world. It asks you to change the way you inhabit the world. And when that shift happens on the inside, the world around you begins to rearrange itself, because nothing is more powerful than a person who has decided to live as who they truly are. Emotional maturity doesn't come with age. It blossoms through understood pain, digested failures, and above all, the power of reflection. In youth, we react. In maturity, we respond. That difference, subtle at first glance, is what completely transforms the way we live. Science already confirms it. As the years pass, the brain develops a greater capacity for emotional self-regulation. It's not about feeling less, it's about feeling with more wisdom. What once triggered reactivity now invites silence. What used to be a trigger now becomes a mirror. Reflection becomes a powerful tool, not for regret, but for learning. It allows us to revisit memories not as prisons, but as pages written to teach us something. Emotional maturity teaches us to accept imperfection without guilt, to ask for forgiveness without humiliation, to say no without the fear of rejection. It gives us a broader view, a gentler perspective, a more compassionate language. And most importantly, it gives us presence, the awareness that we no longer need to chase approval or constantly explain ourselves. Maturity is liberation, because it moves us away from masks and brings us closer to essence. It's when we realize we don't have to win every argument, control every situation, or avoid every pain. We can simply be, breathe, reflect, and choose, not with haste, but with presence. That is what makes maturity an invisible power. It doesn't shout, it doesn't show off, but it transforms everything it touches. Midlife is often seen as an ending, the end of youth, of dreams, of energy. But Carl Jung invites us to view this moment as a rite of passage, a portal to a new beginning, not a conclusion. Unlike a crisis, this phase represents the symbolic transition at the midpoint of life, when a person begins to live with greater depth and authenticity. It's the moment when we start letting go of the roles and expectations imposed by society and begin to listen more closely to our inner voice. This process can be painful and challenging because it confronts us with the unknown. What comes after everything we've built? Jung called this passage individuation, the path to becoming whole, integrating both light and shadow, success and failure, dreams fulfilled and dreams left behind. In this rite, there is a necessary shedding, a symbolic death of the masks and identities that no longer serve us. But that death is also a release. It marks the beginning of living the life we truly desire, with renewed freedom and purpose. Psychologists and scholars note that, despite the discomfort and perceived losses, midlife can be the time of greatest inner growth, wisdom, and personal fulfillment. It is the turning point where we shift from an outward-focused existence to a deeply inward and meaningful journey. Midlife, then, is not a decline, it is an ascent, a chance to be reborn into a more truthful, whole, and authentic life. It is the beginning of something far greater than any crisis, the awakening to who we truly are.